So this talk is basically about the legend of the long-lost Castle of Bradford, which is sometimes known as the Black Castle of Bradford. Is this something that people have actually read into yourselves? Does anybody have any idea what this is?
Skipton Castle.
Skipton Castle, yes. I grew up in Bradford, but I actually live now in Emsey, just on the edge of Skipton. So I pass this if I go into Skipton or out of Skipton. So Skipton Castle, according to Historic England, is one of the best preserved examples of a medieval castle in the country. Now, this is where I have to look at my notes. It was 1090 it was built under the orders of a Norman baron called Robert de Romel. And essentially it is still largely intact. It's at the top of the high street, slightly elevated, very close to water, to a spur canal as well. Anybody any idea what this is? No? This is Clitheroe Castle, which is a ruined castle in Clitheroe. It's a market town in East Lancashire. Very high up, overlooking the town, but not intact anymore. Its origins are debated, but it's generally thought it's of Norman origin and it was built during the 12th century, but people don't quite know for certain. Anybody any idea what this is? Exactly. This is. Anybody know what it's called?
High Point.
High Point, yes. And it was built in 1972 by the John Brunton Partnership as headquarters for. Yes, the building. Yes, that's right, the Building Society. And it's Grade 2 listed now. Apparently, it's a prominent example of brutalist architecture. I think as well it's generally regarded as probably the ugliest building in Bradford, and probably I suppose but that's brutalist architecture for you, isn't it? It's not going to be pretty, it's pretty functional. And the connection with the other two sites is that there are people who believe that either this site or a site very close to this area was originally the site of a castle in Bradford. And that's basically what we're going to look at and debate today. So, in 2021, there was an article published on a website called vocal.media, which is like a blog type website. And it claimed that Bradford once had a castle. It suggested the High Point site, or somewhere very close by, as being the actual location of that castle, and it noted that there used to be a manor house that existed on the site of High Point, built in 1678, something like that. It thought, well, the author considered the idea that perhaps it had been built in response to the Scots raids in the north of England, because Bradford had been a victim of the Scots raids, and that perhaps it was to provide more of a sort of fortress for perhaps at least the bigwigs, somewhere for the VIPs to be able to be safe. Allegedly, the castle was used by John o' Gaunt, who was the lord of the manor of Bradford in the 1300s, and it was even alleged in the article that King Edward II had stayed there at one point. The article then suggested, I should really be doing this. No, I shouldn't. I thought I'd put some more notes on. The article then suggested that later in its life, the castle had effectively become a prison for the area, that its walls had become blackened as a result of torches and fires that were regularly lit around it, which created a sort of foreboding image, and people in Bradford wanted it to be torn down and so on. The main issue, though, was that the article didn't cite a single source, so it didn't actually say where this alleged information had come from. Now, I did contact the author and I asked him, and he couldn't remember where he got it from, which is interesting. But he basically reiterated that he definitely had seen some evidence that there had been a castle in Bradford, and he believed that there had been once a castle in Bradford. 2022, a further article was published on the romanised.com website, which is like a blog type website, and it basically suggested the same idea. It suggested that there had been a castle built in Bradford during the Norman period, though it didn't last very long for some reason, and that the stonework of the castle had subsequently been incorporated into local dwellings and local commercial buildings. And again, sadly, the article didn't cite any sources. It just basically said that this was the case. And then since then, there have been further articles and posts on social media. If you were to look at Facebook history groups, for instance, there has been quite regularly people who've been posting up claims that there have originally been, that there was at one time a castle in Bradford. When I've ever contacted people and said, well, where have you got this idea from? Where's your material? Quite often they've cited the 2021 articles and the 2022 article as evidence of this being the case. But the question is, okay, you could dismiss this as just fantasies. Somebody's come up with an idea and it's run away because people want to believe it. But is there actually more to this? When I started looking at this, because to begin with I was incredibly sceptical about the idea, I suppose growing up in Bradford and nobody ever mentioning there being a castle in Bradford, it was like, well, where's this come from? But the idea is not new. John James, has anybody heard of John James? Yes? Do you want to tell us who he was?
Well, he's the most distinguished Bradford historian, I think, from the 1840s onwards, although his books have been republished. And I'm interested that you've mentioned him, because to the best of my knowledge he doesn't mention Bradford Castle, so you may have found something that I've missed.
In this book he does. 1841, the History and Topography of Bradford. He mentions the idea that Bradford may have once had a castle. Now, he doesn't come out in favour of definitely Bradford did have a castle, and his the things which suggest it are very anecdotal. A lot of it is more gossip and hearsay from local people, and some sort of minor sort of circumstantial things, which I'm going to go into in a bit. So he keeps an open mind, I would say. Maybe there was a castle. Perhaps it makes sense that Bradford did have a castle. Maybe not necessarily at the site that we're going to look at, but he doesn't come out and say yes, there definitely was a castle. William Screwton. Has anybody heard of William Screwton? Yes? Another author about Bradford, history of Bradford a bit?
Yes, this time writing in the 1890s.
1890s, yes. 1898, this book, Pen and Pencil Pictures of Old Bradford. So again, he does consider the idea that there was a castle, and possibly during the De Lacy period, but he doesn't actually come out and say definitely there was a castle. So the point is really that the idea that there was a castle has been around for a long time, but people haven't really been able to come up with anything that's led to firm conclusions, I would say. So, why do people think that there's been a castle in Bradford? So, when we consider the High Point site, there's the elevated position of the site. So that's one argument that regularly comes out if you look on the internet. The presence of the Castle Hotel adjacent to the site, which we will go into in a bit. But it is around the corner. Former district of Black Abbey nearby, which is more to do with the idea of the castle being the Black Castle of Bradford, and some arguments around wording, but again we will have a look at that. There's the idea that Bradford was en route to other major places, so it needed to have something like a castle in order to for important people to stay and have sustenance and be safe. And then there's also the argument about Upper Castle Street in West Bowling and the now lost Castle Street, which was a bit closer to what is now the city centre as well. And that they, again, are more evidence that there was a castle. So, let's have a look at the first argument, the elevated position of the site. So it's true, I would say, from what I've seen, most castles during the period in question were built on elevated sites. The two examples that I gave you, Clitheroe Castle especially is a very good example of an elevated castle, built right on top of a hill. Perhaps to a lesser extent Skipton Castle, although it is still slightly elevated when you look at the geography of the area compared to the rest of the town. And there are plenty of other examples. I've had grandparents in Pickering, and this Pickering Castle, which is, from what I remember from my childhood, was quite a steep hill that you had to climb in order to get up to those ruins. And other places I've known. Does anybody know Brough in Cumbria? Yeah, there's a Castle Brough that's not far from the village, which is an old ruin of a castle again. And again, that's on a hill. So yes, that's definitely true. But practically all castles were also built on water, or very close to a source of water. And herein lies the problem. The nearest reliable source of water is Bradford Beck, which is half a mile down the hill. And it's not really practical when you consider it. Castles needed water not just for drinking and for bathing and for washing, but they also, typically would create moats as part of their first line of defence as well. So it just makes the argument that would be a good place for a castle a bit questionable, I would say, really. Okay. Castle Hotel. Anybody been in the Castle Hotel? Yeah, it's quite. I don't live in Bradford anymore, as I said, but it's one of my favourite pubs in Bradford. I think because it's a rail ale pub. So, junction of Grattan Road and Barry Street. And Barry Street is actually quite relevant to this, the name Barry Street. So it was built in 1898 by an Irish architect called John Michael Barry, and his initials are on one of the outside walls. He was also responsible for designing quite a few buildings around that area, and there is a street that's named after him, Barry Street. Now, he named the building, the castle, after his native Castle Blaney, which is just into the Republic of Ireland from what I remember. It's just over the border from Northern Ireland. So the whole argument that this is evidence that there was a castle in that area, this can't really be relevant, because that is the reason that the castle is called the castle, and it's well documented. It's not like it's just an argument that somebody's come up with in more recent times. Black Abbey. Does everybody know where Black Abbey is? Or was? Ish. It's a bit blurry, is this image. Do people know where White Abbey Road is? Yeah. One side there's, I think some people may still call it White Abbey. There's quite a lot of sort of social housing. There's flats.
It's still called White Abbey. Definitely.
Yeah. There was a section of land on the other side that was known as Black Abbey. I think from what I've found, not that many people were as familiar with the name Black Abbey as they were with White Abbey. But arguably White Abbey became quite a notorious neighbourhood actually. And again, it was one of the areas which was a slum which then got cleared. So Black Abbey. So there is the suggestion that, particularly from people who talk about the Black Castle of Bradford, that the name Black Abbey is somewhere connected with it, as though, well, maybe people are getting Abbey and Castle mixed up or something like that. But there was a charity called the Black Abbey Dole Charity. And a dole was basically a redistributing of money to the poor and needy, and it owned land in that area at one time. My understanding is that it owned properties and it rented out those properties, and that's where it got its income, which was then redistributed to the poor. But the documentation behind the charity suggests the land was originally owned by an abbey that was elsewhere. So it could have been Fountains Abbey, it could have been Kirkstall Abbey, it could have been somewhere else. But there wasn't actually an abbey sited in the Black Abbey area. Similarly, there was never an abbey sited in the White Abbey area. They were used as granges. Does anybody know what a grange was?
A sort of ancillary sheep farm, usually.
Yeah.
In this area.
Yes, that's right, yes. Yes, so, yeah, sheep farming or farming generally, it could be as well. And there are places which have got Grange in the name, you know, like Lower Grange, for instance. I think there was an Upper Grange in Bradford at one time. Was it in Heaton? Somewhere near Haworth Road or something, that area. But basically, yes, it's farming, but it's connected with an abbey, or, you know. So the black is connected with the order of monks, which were Benedictine monks. So they will have wore black robes, basically. And similarly, White Abbey, practically the same, but the order of the monks were Cistercian monks, so they wore white robes. And that seems to be generally the favoured theory as to why these two places have got those names. But then tracking back to this topic, the black, you know, it's quite clear then that Black Abbey has nothing to do with the Black Castle being where Westcott is now. Right, another argument. Bradford was en route to major places. I would say this is probably one of the weaker arguments, because I think when you look at it, well, firstly, why would you need to build a castle? There are other examples, you know, like a manor house or some other structure that you could put people in, and you know, eventually there was a manor house on that site. But the main point I would say is that Bradford isn't actually on the main route between other major places when you look at the geography and topography of the surrounding area. So I grew up in Biley in South Bradford, and you have Leeds to the east and you've got sort of Halifax to the west-ish. So if I wanted to catch a bus as a teenager to Leeds or to Halifax or go from one to the other, I didn't have to go through the city centre. I went on a bus. I caught a bus that went from Leeds to Halifax and Halifax to Leeds. And you know, similarly, when so for instance, when the canals came to Yorkshire, when the Leeds and Liverpool Canal was built, it essentially bypassed Bradford because it followed the River Aire, and a spur canal obviously had to then be built. When the Leeds and Bradford Railway Company built what we tend to call the Airedale line now from, well, originally I think it was from Leeds to Shipley and then it extended to Skipton. Again, it followed the Aire Valley, and so they had to build a spur line to what used to be Bradford Market Street Station and now is Bradford Foster Square. And at the other side, when the what we call the Caldervale line was built by I think it was the Leeds and Manchester Railway Company, from Leeds across to Halifax, across to Manchester. Again, it bypassed Bradford, and so a spur line then had to be built down to the Exchange Station, which is now Bradford Interchange. So I would question whether Bradford actually was on the route between major places. I mean, obviously it was on some routes, but for instance, somewhere like Halifax to Leeds or going across into Lancashire, I would say not. And another example is the M62. You know, in more modern times that was built, so we had to build a spur motorway effectively. You know, the M606 had to be built. The other thing to bear in mind as well is at the time that we're considering, which is sort of the Norman period, roads in England were essentially dust tracks. They were particularly bad in the north of England, and Bradford was barely a village at that time as well. It wasn't a large market town or anything like that. So I'm not sure really there is much in the way of validity with this argument. Now we can come back to this in a bit when I've finished talking if you want to talk further about this. But I'm really not sure that it can be said it was en route between major places. And then the other argument is Castle Street and Upper Castle Street. So Castle Street itself has gone now. Upper Castle Street is still in West Bowling. It's about 1.5 miles south-southeast of Westgate. And as I say here, Castle Street would have been about 1 mile south of Westgate. Now, from my point of view, the main problem is that these places were originally part of Bowling rather than Bradford. And I think as a result, the influence over the naming of these places is more likely to have been very local. I can't really see it being that they were more Bradford influenced. Now there is a point here. Now this isn't something I can prove. This is more of an argument looking at this. I think that the names of these streets is more likely connected with Bowling Hall, and I think that it is likely people referred to Bowling Hall as a castle. Now the reason for this is the Ilkley, right? The market town of Ilkley had a manor house, but people used to refer to it as the castle. To the point that in front of the site is Castle Yard. Similarly, there is some evidence that people who lived in Shipley, when Shipley had a manor house, people referred to it as the castle or a castle. Now, most people would not have ventured very far from their village or their town. You know, their lives would have been very, very local. So their experience of what was and wasn't a castle would have been quite limited as well. And I think it's more likely that if people in Ilkley often refer to their manor house as a castle, if people in Shipley refer to their manor house as a castle, that people in Bradford would have equally referred to their manor house as a castle. It's not a perfect argument, but I think in the balance of probabilities, it's likely that that would have been the case. And so I feel that it's more likely that is what influenced the naming of Castle Street and Upper Castle Street, rather than there being any castle in Bradford. And of course, the site that we're talking about, we definitely know there was a manor house built on it. So, yes, to reiterate that, really, perhaps the idea that there was a castle on that site is more likely to simply be that local people referred to the manor house as being a castle, rather than there actually being a fortress originally on that site. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to ask, what do you think?